Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be back with you. Last Monday, if my date is correct, I think we celebrated for the 50th time Earth Day, which started in 1970 under the leadership of one of our own from Wisconsin, Senator Gaylord Nelson. This time of the year when we celebrate this event, it not only reminds us how much our physical life depends on our care for nature, but there's also a spiritual dimension, which those readings pointed out this morning. The Native American people, the first ones who walked this land where we live, always learned from nature courage, as Margaret said, limitation, kindness, resignation, that there was always something bigger than ourselves that we were part of. Nancy Wood's vision reminds us that the pains that we share sometimes from one another, even if we can't get forgiveness or strength from them, when we go to the mountains, we draw great strength from the permanence of nature. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his beautiful transcendental vision beyond just the material, looked at those roses and said they are always perfect, and they remind us to live in the present as nature does. The Earth Mother, in that beautiful story that Margaret read, reminds us not only of the beauty, but of the rhythm of life and how all of life in nature depends upon itself, even sometimes when there is humor in it by the creatures themselves. The tradition that I come from, Christianity, I remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, "Look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. Look how they are cared for. There is something bigger than they that are carrying them." And so we should learn from that to trust, and to trust in a power beyond ourselves that nurtures both nature and ourselves. But we well know that our relationship with nature right now is not what it should be. Last October, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reminded us that we have about 12 years left before some species will disappear and where some of the damage we're doing to the environment will be irreversible. Even our own federal government right now, 13 federal departments last November indicated that the disasters that we see getting worse in our country, storms, droughts, wildfires, are really due to stronger global warming, and that without aggressive action, they could become worse. These are members of our government, even if the president himself doesn't accept those words. The scientists in our government do. So if we are going to turn things around, and if nature does have not just a physical but a spiritual meaning for our souls, can the great spiritual traditions of the world help us do this? 80% of the world today shows some sort of affiliation with a major religious tradition. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. These 5 great religions represent about 80% of the world, and then you have another 5 or 6% represented by the tribal religions, the Native American religions, Wicca, and others. Can these traditions, which have always seen a spiritual dimension in nature, motivate us, move our hearts to take action? And I think the answer is yes, but also no. Let me explain. In the run-up to the December 2015 Paris Climate Conference, all of the major religions of the world came out with very powerful statements. We may not have heard them, but they were issued, reminding all of the people in these traditions of the necessity to reduce gas house emissions, support policies creating clean energy sources, and to control fossil fuels, and to make changes in the personal lifestyles of all of us. All of these major statements declared that they take science very seriously, and they wove into their statements the links between their respective scriptural sources and the sacredness of nature. And so you had the Pope Francis in his apostolic letter, Laudato Si. You had 300 leading American rabbis in this country making a declaration. The Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change was issued by leading Muslim scholars and imams. The Hindu Declaration on Climate Change by Hindu spiritual leaders. And the Buddhist Declaration on Climate Change, signed by over 1 million Buddhist practitioners and leading monks, such as the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. All of these statements were presented to the governmental delegates at the Paris Conference and disseminated widely among the global networks of all of these major religions. So the words have been spoken by the leaders of these religions, and they're very strong and they're very pointed to the fact that we need to act to save nature, both physically and spiritually. But the words have also led to actions. Another very positive thing that's been happening is since the 1980s, all of these major religious traditions have put personnel and money behind projects at local levels around the world to save the environment. And there are now international consortia of religious organizations. For example, the Alliance of Religion and Conservation International acts to help us world religions create environmental programs. It works with 11 major religious traditions and denominations of each on educational projects, creating sacred nature reserves, urban planning, professional development throughout the world. The United Religious Initiative is an expanding community of individuals and organizations with religious connections to build cultures of peace, justice, and healing for the earth and all its living beings. It has regional staffing in 7 geographic areas of the world. It helps support more than 200 self-organizing cooperative circles with more than 15,000 members in 47 different countries, representing more than 88 spiritual indigenous traditions who share a common vision and a commitment to the environment. And these consortia now help support local projects throughout the world. The Ecological Judaism and Jewish National Fund in Israel, Global Catholic Climate Movement and Catholic Climate Covenant in the United States, the North American Coalition for Christianity and Ecology, the European Christian Environmental Network, Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences, Green Muslims USA, Moroccan Mosques Go Solar, the Chipko Movement, Hindu movement in the Indian Himalayas, and the MLUP Baitong Buddhism and Environment Program in Cambodia, and the Ecology Monks in Thailand, just to mention a few. And there are thousands now of these organizations. And they are carrying out sustainable development projects, for example, wildlife and habitat protection, environmental education programs, community-based land and water conservation, non-industrial farming, uses of solar heating, like we heard this morning that you're supporting. Some of them promote divestment in companies producing fossil fuels by members of their religions. In some of the action projects, for example, the Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist projects, spiritual values and even rituals are included as part of the projects in order to root them into the local cultures and beliefs of the people and to attract more people into the project. So these projects have a spiritual as well as a scientific impact on the cultures. Now, what impact is this having on the rank and file members of these traditions? The leaders have spoken, the projects are there, but is it seeping down to the 80% in the world, throughout the world, who show some sort of affinity with these traditions? Well, let me give you some of the results. There are some happy results and not so happy results. Majority, in an opinion survey of 40 nations by the Pew Research Council in 2015, asked whether pollution is a serious problem. Majorities in all 40 nations throughout the globe polled said it is a very serious problem, and there was a global median of 54% who said it's extremely serious. Moreover, a median of 78% supported the idea of their country limiting greenhouse gas emissions. That's hopeful. Now, while there's no one global survey that correlates religious belief and practices with these attitudes, there is partial data which is illustrative. In the Pew survey of 2015, what they found was that people in Latin America and Africa had very high support for doing something on the environment. And in Latin America and Africa, there is relatively high religious practice among the indigenous religions, Christianity, and others. 74% in Latin America and 61% in Africa believed that something needed to be done about the environment. However, in other regions of the world, the survey found that there was less support. 45% of the residents in the Asian Pacific area, which as we know will be threatened by rising water, only 45% on those island nations felt that there was a problem. And only 38% in the Middle East and only 18% in China felt that there's a problem and that something had to be done about it. So although there have been strong statements by religious leaders in Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism about concern for the environment and encouragement to take action to protect it, such calls do not appear to be mobilizing public opinion very rapidly in their respective regions. In the United States, the Pew Research Center found in 2010 that while only 45% of Americans in 2010 believed that climate change was a serious problem, a strong majority of all religious groups favored strong government action to protect the environment. Nevertheless, the Pew survey found that religion among Americans is not the determinative influence in shaping their views on the environment. There's only a modest religious element in attitudes about environmental protection. Solid majorities of major religious traditions in this country do favor stronger laws and regulations. 73% of white evangelical Protestants do. 79% of black Protestants. 85% of Catholics. 84% of unaffiliated. But what the survey found is that religion has far less influence on our opinions about environmental policy than other factors do. Just 6% of Americans in that survey in 2010 said that their religious beliefs had the biggest influence on what they think about environmental rules. Education and what people hear or read in the media are the strongest drivers of opinions about environmental regulations. Moreover, under half, only 47%, of those who said they attended worship services regularly in their tradition said that they ever heard a clergy person speak about the environment. More black Protestants, 59%, than any other religious group, do report hearing about the environment from their clergy. However, the majority of white Catholics, 64%, 59% of evangelical Protestants, 51% of mainline Protestants said they never hear anything about the environment in their place of worship. So, despite major statements on the environment by leaders at the top of these religious institutions, the message is not being preached regularly in houses of worship in the United States. Moreover, it's apparent that political party affiliation has a major cleavage factor among all these religions. In this country, more than 8 in 10 Catholic Democrats say there is solid evidence that the earth is warming, compared to just half of Catholic Republicans. While 6 in 10 Catholic Democrats say global warming is a human-made phenomenon and that it poses a very serious problem, only about a quarter of Catholic Republicans agree. So despite the strong words of Pope Francis, party affiliation is more important than listening to the Pope for Catholics. What about Protestants? There was an October 2012 survey of Protestant pastors in this country and what they think about the environment. And what it showed was that pastors, Protestant pastors' views of environmental issues show that Protestant pastors in the northeast of the United States, older pastors, and pastors self-identifying as Democrats tend to be more environmentally active compared to younger pastors, Republican pastors, and counterparts in other regions of the country. Pastors identifying as Democrats are the most likely to agree, 76%, in the validity of human-made global warming, followed by independents, 20%. Just 7% of Republican Protestant pastors strongly agree that we have a problem with the environment. So, what do we conclude from all of this? There's good news and there's bad news. The Chinese would say there's yin and yang. It's not that our religious leaders globally are not seeing the problem or taking science seriously or making strong statements. And it's not that religions aren't beginning to put their resources to bear. And in some areas, for example, in Africa, in Latin America, some of what these religious groups are doing are reaching into rural areas where governments have very little interest in going or don't have the resources to do, and it's the religious groups that are beginning to do saving water and so forth. So they are acting. But that is not enough. Because unless the opinions of the people who practice these religions and who can make a difference politically really follow through, there is a major problem. And so the problem is not that religions aren't saying something and doing something, and it's not that many religious people don't see it's an issue, but particularly in our own country, and the surveys in Europe have showed the same thing, that in Europe, people's opinion about the environment depends upon which party they affiliate with. It's not about their humanistic values, or Europe is certainly much less religious than we are, but they have moral values. People are very humanitarian, but it's their political affiliation that is determining how they look at the environment. So politics has really captured, certainly in the North Atlantic region, the attitudes of people much more than moral persuasion or religious arguments. So what do we do? Well, I don't know. I don't know what we do. Would more sermons on the environment help in houses of worship? Well, definitely they would. You can only guess, I have my opinions, about why we don't hear those sermons. I, as a Roman Catholic, hear sermons about LGBTQ and about abortion, because the pastor claims those are moral issues, but we don't hear other issues like poverty or immigration or the environment. Why? I'm just using my own tradition as an example. Why are people silent? Could they make a difference? I don't know. But certainly the top leaders in these communities are trying to make a difference. But it does not seep down to the people who hear the message weekly. So I think we have a lot to do, and we have a lot, to try to remind people of this. And you folks are on board. I mean, this is like preaching to the choir. If I gave this talk in my church, I think half of them would walk out. And I must say, one of the things that's saddened is even though there's a very high support in this country by evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics that the environment is important, 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. 60% of white Catholics voted for Donald Trump. And the latest survey is that 52% of Roman Catholics who attend Mass regularly still support the president and all his policies, and 68% of evangelicals. So, and of course political leaders can manipulate that, and we know that. So what do we do? You remember the 1960s, you remember the anti-war movement, you remember the civil rights movement, clergy people were out there with others. Where are we? Where are we? And which prophet is it in the Jewish scriptures who said, when the leaders are silent, the people have no hope, or their hope is diminished? So we have a lot of work to do, not only as citizens, but to try to get religious communities to practice what their leaders are preaching. We have some thoughts.